In today's aviation accident investigation and analysis video, we will go back to the Finland of the 1960s. We will take a much closer look at a disaster that broke families apart and was a consequence to much needed reforms across the Finnish aviation industry's tradition of breaking some mandatory rules that never should have been broken. Strap your seat buckles, grab your popcorn, and enjoy, since this is Aero Flight 311. In aviation, we have a lot of countries that have innovated the industry with many groundbreaking achievements. They have also had their fair share of accidents. For example, the British aviation industry was the first one to offer a jet engine airplane for airline operations with the de Havilland Comets. Or take the Americans, who not only invented the whole industry of aviation with the Wright Flyer, but also have designed some of the most popular airliners to this date. There are many other nations with significant contributions to aviation safety and modernization, such as the Soviets, the French, and the Germans. However, there are many nations with their own historical aviation advancements, innovations, and accidents, which are usually forgotten because they just are considered to not be any irrelevant compared to other nations. One of these nations is Finland, which will also be the topic of this video. A country which is considered to be mostly a winter holiday destination amongst tourists. Now, if I asked you to list things about Finnish aviation and you were not born in the country, you might point out Finnair, the flag carrier, or maybe the Air Force and its long-time serving very questionable symbol in the roundel. Or maybe even one of the last operational DC-3 aircraft in the world. The national carrier is very old, and it's the 9th oldest operating airline in the world according to Wikipedia, flying its first flight back in November 1923. Finnair is one of the safest airlines in the world, having suffered only 3 accidents that have seen fatalities on board. This video focuses not only on the carrier's deadliest accident, but also the deadliest air disaster involving a Finnish aircraft and the country of Finland. The accident sequence starts with the pilots flying the aircraft involved in the accident, Oscar Hotel Lima Charlie Charlie, for a round trip to Sweden's capital Stockholm. They flew the route via Turku and Mariehamn and would fly the same route back, just with one more stopover in Pori, Finland. The pilots would then enjoy New Year's Eve in Helsinki by drinking, and then after a day's rest fly to Kronaby with stopovers in Pori and Vaasa. The pilots would end up meeting up in Kronaby with an employee working at the airport. The group decided to go drink together for some time. Hattinen and Halme, who are the pilots of the accident flight, would end up drinking a lot during the night. They first went to eat at the captain's hotel's restaurant where he was staying at. The pilots would be drinking beer and gin during their dinner, according to eyewitnesses. The investigation estimates that at 12 a.m. the group would go to a place where Halme, which is the first officer, was supposed to sleep at. The nighttime adventures would continue as the crew and the airport employee would drink cognac together. The pilots and the Kronaby airport employee would then go at 12:30 in the night to drink cognac for the second time at the place where the airport employee was supposed to sleep at. Both of the pilots would end up sleeping in the airport employee's place, and finally, at around 2 a.m., the pilots would stop drinking and go to bed. In the morning of the disaster, the pilots have done the unthinkable. They're clearly not fit to fly the flight back to Helsinki, and they have drunk a lot of alcohol with barely any sleep on top of that. They would be picked up with a leased truck that would drive the pilots as well as the sole flight attendant to the airport. In fact, I want to dedicate this segment to just how ridiculous amounts of alcohol the pilots had been consuming before their, well, let's just call it their final flight of the day. After the accident, autopsies would be performed on the pilots, which indicated that Captain Hattinen had 2 promille of alcohol in his system, meanwhile First Officer Halme had 1.56 promille. In the United States, you will be charged with DUI if you're caught driving with more than 0.8 promille of alcohol in your blood, and in Finland the legal limit is stricter at 0.5 promille. It's borderline miraculous that they even managed to take off from Kronaby and start their landing into Vaasa airport. But we aren't talking about driving, so let's see what the local limits for flying are for your BAC level. The European Aviation Safety Agency, or EASA, demands a BAC level of 0.2 promille, before flight, meaning that both of the pilots should never have flown an aircraft on the day of the disaster. I couldn't find their Finnair required BAC levels at the time of the accident, but I can tell you that it wouldn't be making much of a difference. The important point here is to understand that the pilots were never supposed to fly in the conditions they were in the morning. To say that the pilots weren't doing a good job on the 3rd of January would be an astounding misunderstanding, but that doesn't mean the pilots were totally inexperienced. The first officer, Halme, was 25 years old at the time of the accident and had around 2,700 hours of experience in the cockpit and had worked for Aero for 3.5 years. Hattinen, the captain of the flight, was 37 years old and had 5,800 hours of experience in the flight deck and had been a captain since July 1956 at Aero. Both of the pilots must have had knowledge over how much alcohol they could consume, but they would still neglect this. Obviously, this raises the question why, but that's impossible to answer. The sequence of events prior to the disaster are poorly known. This is mainly because at the time of the accident, no authority in Finland demanded a flight data recorder or a cockpit voice recorder to be on board an aircraft. Hattinen, the captain, did a brief but very rushed check of the exterior of the aircraft. The investigation only claims that Hattinen checked the flaps on the DC-3 for ice, which there was none of. The first officer was responsible for receiving weather information from Kronabu and Vasa, and both cities seemed to have good weather conditions at the time of the reports were taken. The first officer also got weather information from Pori, where the flight was scheduled to continue after landing into Vasa. The aircraft took off just like routine. It had 1,200 liters of fuel to fly with, and its takeoff weight was 11,250 kilos, or 28,000 pounds for my American viewers. The only thing mentioned in the investigation report is that the aircraft's initial takeoff roll was slower than expected, but this didn't cause the accident nor did it affect anything else on the accident flight, so I will leave it at that. Since there is no flight data recorder to analyze in this case study, I'll introduce the U.S. Aviation proposed flight plan based on eyewitnesses and the report of Aero 311. The aircraft flew from Kronabu and is known to have flown way below the assigned minimum flight level at only around 500 feet above the ground. The aircraft, according to multiple eyewitnesses' accounts, flew at an approximate altitude of 100 meters or 330 feet. The flight flew on the departure runway's direction until the town of Ähtava, which is located 13 kilometers or 8 miles south of the departure runway 35/01. After reaching Ähtava, the aircraft reportedly made a right turn facing towards Vasa. During the flight, the weather changed multiple times. Initially, the weather conditions had barely changed from the ones the ATC in Kronabu airport had provided the crew with. Weather was also the first reason for contact between the tower in Vasa and the accident flight. After the first transmission, the weather got horrendous at the airport. The first contact established a cloud base at 8,600 feet with overcast clouds, and the next report Vasa Tower received concluded a visibility of 1 kilometer, a cloud base of 8,200 feet with overcast clouds, and the airport was experiencing foggy weather. The first officer, who was believed to be responsible for radio communications, struggled to respond to some of the transmissions made by the ATC. Specifically the ones he would have received from Vasa around halfway into the flight. The flight stayed silent for this time, contacted Vasa later, and received the information for the weather conditions and clearance to the radio beacon Seppä, among other things. The pilots contacted Vasa Airport when they received the final weather report prior to their expected arrival at 7:39 a.m. Halme responded to the ATC's weather report as follows. The weather has been copied. In a few minutes we'll be at the beacon, here referring to the Seppä beacon on Vasa approach. This would be the last known contact that happened between anybody on board the flight and the ground. The crash happened at an estimated time of 7:40 a.m. local time. Vasa ATC tried contacting the flight between 7:41 and 7:49 a.m., and after there was no response, the ATC personnel on duty had alerted the airport and Vasa fire departments, who reached the crash site at around 8:15 a.m. The first eyewitnesses arrived at the crash site at 7:55 a.m. The fire caused by the crash was extinguished at around 9:10 a.m., around 1.5 hours after the crash. To say that the crash wasn't violent would be an almost negligible claim to make. Just before the flight made contact with the ground, it was at an altitude of 50 meters or 160 feet. It made a rapid turn to the left of 70 degrees for an unknown reason just prior to the disaster and crashed violently to the ground at an angle of 60 degrees. This turn does make sense, but it's far too large of a turn for a civilian or even a military DC-3 to perform. Unfortunately, it's up to speculation as to why the pilots made this turn, but I feel like that this was a dodging maneuver to avoid contact with the trees around the crash site. The victims on board suffered horrific injuries, all 25 dying on board. Most of the bodies were badly burned, and the police would be in charge of identifying the bodies after the accident. None survived the accident on board, and it remains the deadliest in Finnish history to this date. Aero would crash only one aircraft, another DC-3, in the autonomous region of Åland after this flight, but that's a story for another time. The investigation concluded that the main cause of the accident was, quote, the physical and mental state of the pilots affected by staying up all night and drinking alcohol, even though it was clearly in violation of regulations. The final report and investigation took 5 months and 19 days to be published, counting from the day the investigators got to the scene, which was the day of the disaster, and the day the report was published. The investigators pointed out that since Häkkinen was the pilot flying, he was technically more responsible for the outcome of the accident than First Officer Halme. However, Halme's communication errors, like his incorrect report of their flight level, alcohol intake, and lack of sleep, were pointed out by the investigation too, making both of the pilots equally responsible for the results of the accident. Despite the accident being ranked among the worst ones in the world at the time, the lessons of the accident weren't learned internationally. A good example would be Trans-Colorado Airlines Flight 2286, which was caused by drug overdosing and had surprisingly similar weather conditions to Flight 311, consisting of dense fog and clouds. Now let's talk about something else for a while, specifically on the flight number. A tradition for nearly all airlines is to retire a flight number which has been involved in an accident. For example, the flight numbers for the flights involved in the 9/11 terror attacks, which are these, are no longer used. In fact, this goes on for a large majority of accident flight numbers, but there are just too many, so I won't show you all of them. However, what makes Aero 311 special is that it actually still operates for Finnair. In fact, it was flying still 3 years ago on a weekly basis on the Helsinki to Vaasa route. The reason why Finnair has operated this flight number after the crash is unknown, and you can speculate on that if you want to. After these aviation accident reports and analyzing them for honestly several hours, we need to obviously learn something new and attach it to our everyday lives. I think that from the disaster of Flight 311 we can all learn that drinking and driving, flying or sailing is never a good idea and should always be avoided to keep each other safe, to create safer skies for future generations to come. Thanks for watching. I've really wanted to do this kind of a video for a while, and there's even a video on my grandpa's phone of me talking about an accident I created in my head when I was 4 years old. Yup, I've really wanted to create one of these for a long while. If you want to support my channel and content, you can like, subscribe, and maybe even leave a comment. I'll take any suggestion for a future video since I'll probably be posting something more relaxing or funny for the future. I wish you had a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thanks for watching and for your patience, and as always, stay safe, take care, and have an excellent rest of your day. Peace.